Hello there. So my name is Emma Baldry. I'm the Senior Clinical Research Dietitian and Honorary Senior Lecturer based at Leicester. I have a role within the NIHR Diet and Activity Research Translation Collaboration. I'm very grateful to have been asked to make this presentation today. I'm looking at the topic of time-restricted feeding and whether it's superior to calorie restriction. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will at least have an idea of what the evidence base talks about in that topic. I've taken the perspective from, say, clinical practice. So if you're a clinician, what you might need to know to then look at applying this as an approach. So the content of my presentation, I'm going to start with some definitions and context so that we know what we're talking about. Looking at time-restricted feeding or eating, as it is in humans, and the sort of outcomes that you might see in terms of weight management and metabolic health. And as I say, looking at this application in clinical practice, so how we can apply it in the real world. So definitions and context. In thinking about how this might vary to calorie restriction, first of all, we need to identify what we mean by calorie restriction. So we are assuming that somebody will be taking in less calories or less energy, should we say, than they actually need to maintain their weight. So in looking at this comparison, we're looking at, does time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating, as we see it in humans, is that any different in terms of restricting your energy intake over the whole period? We're looking at different timings, basically, of that restriction. So time-restricted eating itself, it might be the first step in looking at this is how it differs to something called intermittent fasting. And I know your next speaker, Krista, will be looking at that intermittent fasting and be able to define that and indeed time-restricted feeding as well. So how does time-restricted eating differ from that? Well, if you think about our usual eating and fasting cycle, most of us go to sleep at some stage and stop eating. So it depends on how long it is that we spend awake and how much of that time we spend eating as to what our feeding and fasting cycle might be. And the evidence suggests at the moment in developed countries that you might look at between a window of 12 or 15 hours where you might actually have feeding. And that's not just meals, that could include snacks and drinks which have calories as well. So in terms of looking at time-restricted eating, you're looking at restricting that cycle within 24 hours. This is different to intermittent fasting, where you might have extended periods of fasting, and as I say, Krista will be looking at the definitions of those. So within the 24 hours, you might have a short feeding time, which is 12 hours, 10 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours a day. You would then have a longer fasting time. So what do we mean by fasting? Does it mean that we just don't have meals? Well, no. What it means is that we restrict what we have to calorie-free, which could be calorie-free fluids like water. So when you're talking about the feeding fasting cycle, you may be talking about, say, 10 hours in which you can eat, and then you may have 14 hours in which you would be considered fasting. And if you think about the modern feeding fasting cycle that I mentioned, which could be 12 or 15 hours of perhaps snacking and eating, are we ever actually really fasted at the moment? If you think about lipids, for instance, and if you have a high-fat meal, how long is it, do you think, that fat is still within your body and still circulating to actually be described as being fasted? So then we move on to when that eating window might be. So if you think about when that 10 hours might be, is it 10 hours, say, from now? It could be from 6 p.m. for 10 hours. It could be from 6 a.m. for 10 hours. If you have a short window of 4 hours eating, when might that be during the day? Could that be early in the morning, late in the day? And I would refer you to the evidence base around the sort of eating periods which affect health, and most people will probably already be aware of, such as people who work shifts and those who have late night or overnight eating, and how that might affect their health. Within this eating window, we also have the question of how much do you eat? So are we asking people to restrict what they eat during those 4-10 hours of eating, or do we ask them to have ad-lib eating? So whatever you like during that period of time. So if you're thinking about time-restricted eating, you're thinking about a short feeding time, a longer fasting time. When is it exactly that the eating window sits? And are we actually stopping people from eating, or are we just saying, eat whatever you like within that window? The other important difference is that this happens every day. So whereas an intermittent fasting could be a cycle of eating and or fasting, which is, say, 2 days of fasting or reduced intake and then 5 days, so something like a 5-2 diet, we're looking here at this cycle being every day. You have a feeding cycle and a fasting cycle. So the other thing to consider, and from a clinical perspective, things to consider in terms of the evidence base, is the sort of evidence base that we have at the moment and how that's translatable. So a lot of the evidence at the moment is initially in animal studies, and obviously you have to bear in mind the differences that you might see when comparing animal studies to human studies. Thinking about the eating window duration that I talked about, does it make a difference when that eating window duration is? So if actually the eating window is 12 hours, and that eating window of 12 hours starts at 8 AM, or that eating window starts at 8 PM. So when you're looking at the evidence base and reviewing articles to consider this, some of the heterogeneity, so some of the differences and variation you might see in the results, are related to both the eating window duration and the timing of that window. I mentioned that during that window, you might be asked to eat whatever you like, the ideal. Have whatever you like during that eating window. The smile comes on your face. If you actually restrict the amount of time that you eat, though, so you would normally eat over 12 or 15 hours, you're asked to reduce that to, say, 8 hours, do you spontaneously reduce the amount that you eat because of that? Do you reduce the number of meals that you have, reduce the snacking time, reduce your energy intake overall? So in interpreting the results, consider that even free-living individuals who are asked to eat whatever they like during restricted feeding time might actually reduce what they have. Not on purpose necessarily, but just because they have less time to do that. Because of the changes that might help, that might take place during this, you actually get either a dependent or independent effect of weight change. So you might actually ask people to energy restrict and limit what they have, or they might be ad libitum and have whatever they like. The aim might be that they don't change their weight, and ideally, if you want to see what the effect of changing the window is, the duration and the timing, you don't really want people to change their weight as well, because otherwise what you have is a variation in the results which is related to the weight change rather than the change in what people are actually eating. So when you consider results in terms of evidence, also consider, is this independent or dependent on weight change? My last point is in interpreting results. Anybody who's on a piece of research, no matter how hard they try, even in quite controlled conditions, might actually change what they eat normally. And so if you think about free-living adults, people who are out there in clinical practice you might want to talk to, consider about the intake composition changes that they might accidentally change. So if you're looking at the results of trials or research studies, also consider if people are actually following what you expect them to be following if they're free living. And we all know the challenges of trying to record what people are actually eating in real life. So, on to a quick summary, and as I say, a quick summary, I have 15 minutes for this entire presentation, so I've summarised this in just a couple of points, but at the end of the presentation there are the references, and I would absolutely direct you to Krista's systematic review on time-restricted eating. So in terms of weight management, if you have isocaloric studies, so in other words, your aim is not to lose weight, your aim is to maintain weight because you want to see what's happening in terms of changing the window duration or the window timing, then studies have been quite short, up to about 12 weeks or 3 months. There has been some weight loss observed, so that means that theoretically, even if you ask people not to lose weight, they would lose some weight. That's positive. It was notable that actually in doing that, it was probably more readily achieved when people actually restricted their meal pattern as well as the amount of time. So in other words, it's not just about let's restrict it to 10 hours, but actually maybe restrict it to 2 meals rather than 3, or 3 rather than 4. If you then look at the ad libitum, so in other words, eat whatever you like, the study's again quite short, looking at the variation in eating windows. So did we actually have 4 to 6 hours to eat, 8 to 10 hours? If I go back to my comment that maybe we normally have 12 to 15 hours of eating, you'll expect to see quite a big change in the shorter eating windows. As you can see there, with these studies, there was moderate weight loss. So again, we're not necessarily intending for people to lose weight. That's not the idea. We're telling them to eat whatever they like, but they still actually manage to achieve weight loss. So it goes back to my point that if you're reducing the window time, bear in mind that people may also reduce the amount they eat just because they have less time in order to do that. So bear that in mind in terms of studies. But overall, the evidence in terms of weight management, it has potential. So metabolic health. So if we go back to my comment about trying to look at whether this is independent or dependent on weight, this is where it gets quite challenging. So summarising the evidence again, very summary. There is potential. So in people who are overweight or obese, there's a potential for people to have a positive change in terms of glucose or insulin, but it's not incontrovertible and the evidence base is somewhat limited. If you then also look at LDL, HDL or TAG, again, it's not consistent. And that may come back to my point about when people have fat in their meals and how long that takes for it to come out of the system in terms of being completely fasted. If you then also look at something like blood pressure, again, there's potential there. They have shown some potential results in terms of reducing blood pressure. But is this independent of weight change? The studies that seem to find a change, which was positive, also seem to find a change which was positive in weight. Not in itself a problem, because people may want to lose weight as well as improve their blood pressure. That's all good. The difficulty we have is that the results are not necessarily equivocal. In other words, there's a lack of evidence at the moment. And what we could do with is some much longer studies, potentially in real life, real world scenarios. So, to the point that I would make in terms of application in clinical practice, as a dietitian, a GP, somebody who's working with people in a consultation, what might be the pros and cons of looking at time-restricted eating? And here you go, here's my summary. So try to weigh it up. So in terms of pros, it's a really good tool which you could use an option for a person-centered approach. The con to that is, like all approaches, it won't suit everybody, and if you're looking at, say, restricting a time window in which somebody can eat, that's going to be affected by their lifestyle, their environment, their cultural and personal preferences. For example, you have a family which have meal times at certain times. How does that affect your ability to manage that? It may be easier as an individual to be able to frame it to a person as a dietary approach, because all you have to do is tell them, well, what you need to do is change your eating period. You can eat what you like, but just don't have anything for 15 hours, 16 hours a day. Again, that might be challenging because sometimes, and the evidence suggests in certainly some Ramadan studies, that when you restrict eating for certain amounts of time, then when you break your fast, you may not necessarily break it with the best quality foods. So just bear that in mind. In terms of it being a simple regime to follow, absolutely. So a person could be described as having a really straightforward change in their dietary regime by changing the duration or timing of their meals. But it needs to be adhered to every day. The evidence suggests that just occasionally following this, you won't get exactly the same results. So just bear that in mind, and certainly expectations will need to be managed. In terms of intake composition, ad libitum, have whatever you like during these hours. It sounds fantastic. The only thing is, bearing in mind people's ability to maintain nutritional adequacy, there may be some shortage, and in terms of people's nutritional status before they start this, it may be worth bearing that in mind. but certainly it's something to consider. In terms of the eating time window, it has some variation. So I mentioned we may be having 12 to 15 hours in normal life. So restricting up to 10 hours might be beneficial. So you don't have to go down to 4 or 6. The thing to remember is that during the fasting period, you really are fasting. So that includes drinks which have energy. It may well support a weight loss maintenance pose after a more restricted regime. So say somebody's lost significant weight, and actually it could be a really good way for them to help to maintain the weight that they've lost. The only thing we don't know is what that loss is going to look like over the long term at the moment. And in terms of research, that's certainly the area we need to look at. So that's my summary for clinical practice. So there are some pros, there are some cons. In terms of references, as I say, I would absolutely recommend Krista's work, and it's fantastic that she's following me. And following me only in the sense in this particular presentation, in no other sense whatsoever. There are also other references here if you're interested in the animal studies which have come first, and also in other systematic reviews. So just to finish up, I've looked at time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating as it is in humans. Is it superior to calorie restriction? At the moment, I wouldn't say it is. It absolutely has a place in person-centered approach to weight management, and I'd be really interested to see the evidence base expanded to see this used in clinical practice itself. Thank you very much.